thank you everybody for being here. It's so sad that we're not going to continue doing this, but I've given you most of what I have, and so I hope I can answer your questions because it's quite new for me, this work. Especially this lecture is a new turn, and I'm really keen to get your feedback. Okay, so who cares? Here's my outline. We're going to do an introduction and recap as before. I'm not going to go through the whole complex systems thing. Probably you're going, phew, thank goodness. I do have one image that I have used all 3 lectures, and I'll point it out when we come to it, and you'll probably notice. But I'm not going to do all of that. I'll just give you a kind of rough overview. And then I'm going to talk about the gender division of labor. And I will look at some of the dynamics of gender inequality, because remember in the first lecture what I argued is that we're a complex dynamic system with these different dynamics. So there's a kind of heteronormative dynamic, there's a white supremacist dynamic, a patriarchal dynamic, and so many others, eugenicist dynamics. So all of these are interacting, and it's quite unpredictable what's going to happen when they interact with each other. I mean, it's not random, as I mentioned. But so what I'm going to be talking about is the broad sociocultural dynamics of inequality, but specifically with respect to care. Then I'm going to talk about how power is built up in care work and what are the possibilities of exit. I'll then consider some possible sources of disruption or way we might think about disruption and reject them. And then I will look at socially networked movements. And that's something that people who are into complex dynamic systems tend to be really into networks. And so the people who are working on social change using this model think that movements should be kind of oriented toward networks. And so I'm going to try, and this is quite new for me. I'm still trying to figure it out, but I thought I'd try it out with you. And then I'll draw the conclusion. Okay. Are you all ready? Okay, here we go. So here's the recap. In my first lecture, I argue that the social formation that we currently inhabit is a complex dynamic system with patriarchal, white supremacist, colonial, and capitalist dynamics. I also argued that working to disrupt these different dynamics in the material systems where they have influence is a way to disrupt systematic oppression. And so part of the point was that rather than thinking that's capitalism, that's the enemy, we should think it's this healthcare system, transportation system, whatever, and the dynamics that are making it racist or sexist, etc. In my second lecture, I argued that local intervention is essential to do justice to the path dependence of value. And I suggested that transformative change can happen incrementally, even though it may require a radical vision to motivate structural change and to sustain the long-term commitment. So it may be that we ought to think radically, but that it's really a good idea to start at least with on-the-ground incremental changes, and then maybe they will cascade and something great will happen, but you don't have to break everything. Yeah, in Silicon Valley, and many people at MIT think that, break it first and then go on from there. That's one of these engineering sort of things, because, you break it and then you figure out how to put it back together and you learn how it, never mind. Anyway, maybe it's spending too much time with engineers that are trying to break stuff all the time. And I go, no, don't break it yet. Sorry, I'll keep going. I also provided an example of a method that addresses 2 challenges that come with organizing, what I called loss of bearings, where change is happening to the practices that you're part of, and you're losing your sense of self, and you're losing something that has been valuable to you. And epistemic foreclosure, where given the ideology, you just can't see where to go next because the ideology has changed the material conditions, and it doesn't seem that there's really a route out. And I used the Nestle water example, bottled water example. And the 2 examples I used were public narrative and co-design as 2 ways of engaging in social movement work on the local level that could possibly address some of the issues of loss of bearings and epistemic foreclosure. And I thought they could be used to address patriarchal dynamics that expose women and girls to gender-based violence and bodily shame, thereby diminishing their capabilities. And yes, I want to say that I wasn't as well prepared for some of the questions as I think I should have been, but I was really, really have been thinking a lot about some of the broader questions about how gender and post-colonialism interact with each other. I've been thinking of things at a fairly abstract level, where gender is something that you can see, gender-based violence and menstrual shame, kind of global. And I've been thinking sort of, okay, I'm trying to intervene in the patriarchal dynamic here that exists in all these different places, but my own view says that I need to kind of make it a little more complicated and complex. So I appreciated that. Okay, I argued, that giving women agency to identify and address these challenges is a step that challenges patriarchal dynamics, even if it doesn't address capitalism, colonialism, and other systematic injustices. Okay, so social reproduction, we've talked a bit about, and I thought just as a recap, it would be good for people who forgot or weren't here. Socialist feminists use the term social reproduction to point to the broad range of sexual, social, and cultural work required for humans to become part of society. This is done as unwaged work in the family, also unwaged work done by slaves, and in wage service work in education, and it is usually assigned to women. The work of social reproduction includes the activities and attitudes, behaviors and emotions, responsibilities and relationships directly involved in the maintenance of life on a daily basis and intergenerationally. So it's not just like doing the laundry, but it's like keeping records of the family and keeping connection with distant relatives and all of that, in addition to the care work of infants and the disabled and the ill and the elderly and such like that. So recent feminist work has argued that we live in a time of carelessness in every domain. There's a text called The Care Manifesto, produced by the Care Collective, and they make this case from interpersonal relations to the global economy, and they argue that we're in urgent need of a politics that puts care front and center. And this is partly prompted also by the pandemic and everything that's going wrong. I mean, there's so much, right? And I want to say I agree with that, but for the purposes of this lecture, I'm going to focus on social reproduction in the form of caregiving in the private sphere, traditionally in families. And I will sometimes talk about waged care work and connect what I'm talking about with waged care work, but I think that women as a whole, even when they do waged care work, also do unwaged care work. And so I think potentially this has very, very broad implications. Okay, so I choose to focus on care because it's a domain where gender oppression is rampant, and the gender norms that govern the family spread far and wide across society. So I think that the fact that women are doing this care work at home often means they're expected to do it at work, and they're supposed to do it at their children's school, and they're supposed to do it everywhere. And so I think that the focus on care work is really important if we want to have a systematic way of addressing gender oppression. Care work is not done in the same way or to the same extent by all women, and non-women also do valuable care work, but there are patterns at different levels of analysis that are worth attending to. So this is, again, one of those questions about what is the level of analysis we're talking about, and there is all this incredible detail of all of the ways that care work is done differently in different frames and societies and cultures and whatever. And I'm trying to step back a little bit from that and look at it at a more abstract level, because I think it is so broad and so systematic that we need to have a picture of what we're up against. So here are some special challenges I think arise when we try to intervene in care. It's a domain that may seem to require a distinctive approach when considering strategies for social change, and here are three of them. The first is women are invested in family care work for many reasons, but among them is affection for those they care for and the intimate relationships that such care work sustains. So keep in mind, social reproduction requires the reproduction of small humans that come out of certain kinds of bodies. And so if you feel as though there's going to be some, emotional connection with the person who made that possible, then it's going to be something that oftentimes there will be close attachments to and intimacy with and such like that. And so that person that you love and care for is someone that you can't just say, oh, I'm just working now when I'm loving you, right? It's not work, it's joy, it's pleasure, it's what gives me meaning, possibly. So that's a problem. And although the structure of family of relations is incentivized by law and politics, the organization of family life is assumed to be a matter for adults in the family to decide, and legal approaches to mandating justice in the family, aside from formally protecting certain basic rights, is not promising, because it would be an illegitimate intrusion for law to dictate the division of labor in the family, for example. And I think we've just gotten to the point where now, it's not expected that the family has to have, a heterosexual couple or children of the same race, or they have to have produced their children biologically and such like that. So there are ways that law has interfered with family formation, chosen families, etc. And, it's just not right, I think, that it should do that. That should be a domain where we have protections from, rape and domestic violence and such like that, but we can't let the state control our intimate lives. Another challenge, the third one, is that although cultures vary in whether or how the nuclear family counts as a private space to be protected, not just from law, but from the gaze of others, efforts to organize family caregivers can seem presumptuous and paternalistic. If there's one thing you learn as a parent, it's to not criticize another's parenting. I don't know if you've learned that. That's at least true in the United States, maybe not here, but that is a no-go. Beauvoir frames this as a matter of dispersal of women across families in their allegiance to their particular family formation. This is from Beauvoir. Women live dispersed among the males, attached through residence, housework, economic condition, and social standing to certain men, fathers or husbands, more firmly than they are to other women. If they belong to the bourgeoisie, they feel solidarity with men of that class, not with proletarian women. If they're white, their allegiance is to white men, not to Negro women. The proletariat can propose a massacre of the ruling class, but women cannot even dream of exterminating the males. The bond that unites her to her oppressors is not comparable to any other. So again, there's a kind of dispersal issue. In Marx anyway, he talks about the French peasants as potatoes in a sack of potatoes, not connected to each other, and that in order to organize, you have to sort of come to share those common interests and see yourselves as a member of a group who have these interests. And I think that sometimes it's very difficult for women to see that they have shared interests because they are scattered across class and race and community and et cetera in their families. So here's the plan. I'm going to argue that a significant factor in women's ongoing oppression globally is the division of labor that situates women as responsible for care work in the family. This division of labor depends on a social categorization system and a set of norms that, although centered in the family, extend well beyond it and affect women's lives in every domain. Unfortunately, this gender division of labor produces a stable equilibrium that's difficult to change, and I'm going to draw that out in some detail. Those who have primary responsibility for dependence have less power in relationships than those who don't, and this makes bargaining within and exit from the relationship difficult. Although many kinds of relationships are constructed along axes of power, there are distinctive problems that arise for caregiving because it's so deeply personal and relational. So yes, I think bosses have this same kind of power over workers. And I think that this happens in a lot of different domains where the relationship is such that there's an equilibrium that gives a certain member of the relationship greater power. But as I said, there are going to be special problems when women who are caregivers and lovers and partners, et cetera, try to leave those relationships. So I'll consider some strategies to change the dynamics of gendered care work to give women more power. Though it will become clear I'm rather skeptical about policy changes, at least until we've done more work to change social norms. And then I'll sketch very briefly a model for social change that takes aim at social norms and is promising as a strategy for transformative change. that's what we're going to do now. Okay, I first want to talk a little bit about gender, because I've spent quite a bit of time working on this in the last 25 years, and I think that the term has many different uses, and I want to acknowledge the different uses while also sort of situating my work against a backdrop of one particular use. So I'm pluralist about gender and think there are multiple ways to understand what gender is that are useful for different contexts. One way is to emphasize gender identity, and I believe that a sincere avowal of one's gender is sufficient to have that gender, and I fully endorse trans rights. So that's just ground level for me. I'm not, don't have any qualms about that. But I also believe that within patriarchal systems, there's a process of gendering that does not take one's self-identity to be sufficient. So, as we know, trans women are gendered as women, or sometimes they're not gendered as women, they're gendered as men in the system, regardless of their identity, right? Because the patriarchy doesn't respect identity as the basis for gender. So it's useful to understand how that system works, even if we object to it, and even if, thankfully, it fails to work in all cases. So so gendering is a dynamic within virtually all societies we know of, and it interacts with those other dynamics, but is not reducible to them. So here's the picture. There's a human, as you see. We don't even know anything about their anatomy, and that's relevant here. They're marked based on presumed biological reproductive function. As I sometimes say to my students, you don't even know if I have a penis, do you? Because we don't show each other our genitals, right, on a daily basis as we walk around, That's just so pretty much any attribution of sex to someone is presumed biological function. And I don't even succeed in having that biological function personally because, I can't have kids. I have kids, as you know, I've talked about my kids, but I can't have them biologically. So, there's a lot of presumptions going on in the world that we're all aware of. Anyway, so there's marking, and then there's ideology. So there's categories, norms, scripts, responsibilities, etc. imposed because you're marked a certain way. You're expected to think a certain way, act a certain way, care for people in a certain way, have sex a certain way, all of that. And then there's hierarchy, which is systematic privilege or subordination along a dimension that is typically motivated and justified by the ideology. So marking plus ideology, that gets you hierarchy. And on my view, which is an outlier, I think that there's a difference between being female and being a woman, where I use woman for the gender. And I think to be a woman is to be subordinated along some dimension by virtue of marking an ideology, and to be a man is to be privileged along some dimension by virtue of the marking and the ideology. It's controversial, I acknowledge that. We don't have to get into the details because this is all you need to know. So even if you don't like that women are the subordinate group by virtue of being marked in the ideology, it doesn't matter. And actually, all I'm saying is that's the way it is under patriarchy. Well, I should say it better. That's the way it is in the current social formation with patriarchal dynamics. That's the correct way to put it. But sometimes I slip and I say under patriarchy. Okay, so gender division of labor. Caregiving is a necessary part of human life. Humans are born helpless and require intensive attention and care to become social subjects. We're fragile and suffer illness and injury and require care to recover or cope with the consequences. We have limited lifespans, at the end of which we're often unable to care for ourselves, and just getting through a day involves a myriad of tasks to maintain body and soul. We're also social beings, so beyond merely keeping ourselves alive, we need connection and interaction, and such connections must be built and maintained. And coordination around such care work is required, for the work of caretaking can be all-consuming, and for periods of time, this can make it difficult, if not impossible, for a caregiver to also meet other basic needs, such as provisioning or security, for example, making money for food or rent. Okay, so caregiving is a lot of work, and sometimes you've got to have it be full-time. right? That's just the way it is. But is it necessary that women do the bulk of the care work, and at what cost? Before proceeding, I want to note that the caregiver breadwinner model, which I'll sometimes kind of be assuming, even though it's no longer stably in place, I'm doing it because it simplifies some things, but I'll make some qualifications along the way to sort of allow for the fact that it's not how most people live their lives anymore in Europe and the US and the UK. And it is also racially, culturally, and class-specific and a product of industrial capitalism. For example, I think I've mentioned this before, in rural agricultural areas, it doesn't really work that way because everyone, but the women still do the care work, right? Okay. So the intersexual racialization of care work creates a further division of labor between white and non-white women. White women have been associated with the domain of spiritual care, and non-white women with menial care. As Maria Marin says, our understanding of social reproduction is distorted by an ideology that frames care as divided into the menial, dirty task and the nurturant, spiritual tasks. This menial spiritual split is responsible for the fact that women of color, often immigrant women, do most of the lowest paid, most demanding jobs of care. This symbolic construction of care as divided between hard, undesirable tasks and meaningful, desirable tasks continues to condition our misperception of care work and to justify the contradictory tendencies to sentimentalize it when we're talking about the spiritual side while materially undervaluing it, and so not paying people who are doing the dirty work effectively. So this split, I think, is really important for understanding this racial division of labor and how white women can get away with being, have candles at the birth and have their husbands there singing to them, and then these babies come, and then they love them so much, and that's a class and race sort of dynamic that is really valorizing and sentimentalizing the process even of giving birth, much less the caregiving that comes after it, whereas there are other people in the world who are lucky to survive childbirth, and it's not such a pretty picture. Okay, so, and yet, in spite of these incredible differences and these racial differences and class differences, there are robust regularities. Although many tasks are divided by gender across societies in different ways, for example, in some societies, rope making or pottery is done by men, and in others by women, caregiving, especially the caregiving of infants, is virtually always assigned to women. So this is a point that Kaylin O'Connor makes, and I'm going to talk in the next little bit a lot about Kaylin O'Connor's work. And anthropologically, yeah, there are lots and lots and lots of tasks that it doesn't matter what gender you are, but it matters what gender you are when you're taking care of a baby. As Kaylin notes, the gender division of labor is a case where we see the full range of conventionality. Some jobs are almost guaranteed to end up performed by one gender or the other, and for others, their assignment is better explained by appeal to chance. This does not mean, however, that females have an innate predisposition to caregiving and males to hunting or do battle. Rather, as O'Connor argues, the pattern can emerge as a response to very basic pressures to divide labor. Caregiving will be none, and almost always some amount of it will be unwaged unless you hire a cleaner, a 24/7 nanny, place the disabled in the infirm and care homes. There's going to be some unwaged labor. And as I'll explain shortly, those who do it are systematically disadvantaged relative to those who don't. Okay, this is Nancy Folbray, has a wonderful, relatively recent book, has worked on care and family for like ever and ever. Nancy Folbray describes some of the disadvantages that accrue to individuals whose primary work is unwaged family caregivers. So she's talking about the traditional caregiver breadwinner situation where you have a full-time caregiver who's a woman. She says, family care providers do not receive an individual paycheck, and the emotional rewards they hope for can be variable and unpredictable. Once committed, it's difficult for them to threaten exit. Specialization in care provision intensifies personal attachments and cultivates person-specific skills that are not always transferable. Productive contributions to family living standards and capabilities are not fungible outside the family. Unlike marketable skills and pension credits, and reductions in paid labor force experience lower women's future earnings, reduce their fallback position in household bargaining. So that's a bit of just a gesture in the direction of how being a full-time caregiver can affect large parts of your life and your earnings and such like that. But it's also going to affect women who don't, do full-time care work and are wage laborers. To be clear, some men give birth to children, are primary caregivers, and do substantial household work, and not all of the disadvantages Fulbrain mentions fall on women who also engage in paid work, though some of them do, especially because women are more likely than men to work part-time or take jobs that allow for the flexibility of combining it with child care responsibilities. So I remember when we learned that I was not capable of giving birth or, actually conceiving a child, I was talking to other people who were in a similar situation, and it was so interesting. Just a little, I like to throw these things out just for food for thought, just a little crumb for thought. Women who were in a couple that was infertile were much more distressed than the men were because they had planned their life course around being a mother who was going to have flexibility in her schedule. And the men, on the whole, hadn't. They had sort of said, yeah, I want to have a kid sometime, but I'm just going to pursue my career because I'm going to have a woman around who's going to be flexible and be able to be home and take care of the kid. And what's also interesting is that the women, and maybe for this reason, were much more willing to consider adoption than the men. Because women were thinking, look, I've planned my whole life around, having a child to take care of, and now you're taking that away from me. That is a loss of bearings, right? That's a loss of bearings. What am I going to do? Like, how am I going to reinterpret my past, and how am I going to think about my future? So they're all up for adoption, and the father is like, yeah, no, I don't think that's necessary. We don't need to do that. And he's the one who's got this career and this paycheck and whatever, and there are other hypotheses about that, but I'm not going to get into them. So the background failure of the state to address race-class disparities, especially the mass incarceration of black men, the failure to provide affordable housing, health care, and early childhood education, that's a compounding factor for black women in the United States because, as you all know, we don't have a health care system. I mean, they call it a health care system, but it doesn't have much to do with health or care. And we don't have, early childhood education provisions. It's pretty pathetic. Okay, so let's talk about the dynamics of inequality. Here's Kaylin O'Connor, and she provides some insight into how self-sustaining unjust systems emerge. She asks, what are the minimal conditions under which social inequity would emerge in society and be stable? And I'm going to start with some of the background assumptions. First, cooperation is an essential human task. Kim Sterelny says, going it alone has probably not been an option for hundreds of thousands of years. That's a really long time. So cooperation is really entrenched. I mean, we think capitalism entrenched. Anyway, just kidding. Cooperation usually brings advantages to everyone in the group, even when there is inequality, because the overall benefits raise everyone's well-being compared to non-cooperation. So here you are, we're not cooperating and everybody is doing really badly, and we start cooperating and we do so in a way that's unequal, but even the people on the bottom are doing better than they would be doing without the cooperation, right? So they're going to be, motivated to participate, because if they get kicked out, they're going to really, be in bad shape. A division of labor tends to be highly valuable. It allows for specialization, which is not only efficient, but rewarding. Like, whoa, my life would be so different if I didn't get a chance to specialize in philosophy, right? Or, all the other things that you do. I mean, specialization is kind of central to much of the satisfactions that we get in life. And it's also very efficient. Now, she's an evolutionary game theorist, and I thought it worth mentioning that she is assuming that evolutionary game theory can provide tools for thinking about how and why groups adopt divisions of labor. And I wanted to make it clear, because I'm going to talk about bargaining, that evolutionary game theory is not the same thing as rational choice theory. And it's importantly different because it's about group behavior, not the rationality of individual choices in the same way. So what we're thinking about is how a group is going to develop certain categorizations like gender markings and race markings and things like that, and what are the norms that the group takes up, and why would they take up those norms instead of other norms, right? That's quite different from rational choice theory, but there's still going to be some talk of bargaining, so bear with me. Okay, this is her book, The Origins of Unfairness, Social Categories and Cultural Evolution. So some coordination problems, correlative problems, require us all to act in the same way. What side of the street do we drive on, right? We all have to drive on the same side of the street because otherwise we crash and die. Other coordination problems, complementary problems, require us to act differently but in sync. Ballroom dancing, right? You've got to know whether you're supposed to start by stepping back or stepping forward, right? Or else you kind of get all tangled up with each other. So that is a complementary problem. And various kinds of divisions of labor and resource distribution involve these divisions of labor that require complementary actions. Complementary problems are solved by establishing roles that are suitably related. But O'Connor argues there's a function that social categories can play in these cases. In particular, actors can use social categories to identify what sort of role each actor should play in social interaction. So categories solve the challenge of coordinating ballroom dance. Step forward if you're a woman and back if you're a man. Though I think I always, like in the foxtrot, I step back first. Anyway, but you know, maybe it's the tango. Oh, she does tend to talk about the tango. Okay. It's useful to be able to rely on the same categories across tasks. So networks of social relations form that regularly position individuals in categories. Fulfilling stable roles associated with such categories builds up broad competencies and shapes our identities. So the idea is, for every possible division of labor, you don't want to have separate categories, right? Different ones for ballroom dancing, and then different ones for who sets the table, or different ones for who takes care of the children and all of this. Because it's just too much work, right? You don't want to you want to rely on relatively stable categories because it's going to be much more efficient. And it does build up broad competencies because that's what a division of labor does. And what makes it cool is that people who are categorized in that role, they become really good at it. And then it also shapes identities, and you have solidarity with other people in that role, et cetera. They teach you things, you teach them things. Yeah, so this is part of the story too, is that you often learn your competency from people who are already in the role. And so this is one of the ways that the certain norms and stuff get passed down, because you learn from your mother what you're supposed to do, et cetera. Okay, so a division of labor is not necessarily inequitable. For example, distinguishing drivers and navigators is unproblematic. So back in the day, none of you remember, of course, but we used to have to drive cars with paper maps. We didn't have, Apple Maps or Google Maps or whatever they were. We had to. I once was in Fort Worth, and I don't live in Fort Worth. It was a very complicated city. And I had two small children in the back of the car, and it was nighttime. And I had to find the way someplace. They were too young to read the map. And it was highways and these spaghetti things. And I was like, oh my God, what am I doing? It was really hard, right? Because I didn't have a navigator. So we rely on navigators. And that division of labor is perfectly fine. And you can also develop, specialization. So my husband, Steve, he's not such a great navigator. I'm a really good navigator. So I could be the navigator and he could be the driver, back in the day when that was possible. Anyway, so it's okay to build up specializations in driving and navigating, That's no problem. It solves our problems. But once categories have been adopted, the cultural dynamics that lead to bargaining norms are radically changed. New norms that are inequitable but not especially efficient arise, and when they do, they can be self-perpetuating. In other words, the development of types sets the stage for serious inequity to spontaneously emerge and to persist between social groups. Now, navigator, driver does it because we don't use that to categorize ourselves in every other sphere of life. Gender, we do, right? So having some typing like this, in the norms associated with don't yell at the driver because it makes him upset and then he veers or whatever, that's a norm that can it can be very specific to that driving situation, and you can yell at him when he gets done driving. No, I'm sorry. For example, And here's an example of how this happens. If Alice and Bob are bargaining, like who's going to do the dishes or who's going to take on a particular set of responsibilities in the household, and Alice is invested in the care of another, her infant, and Bob is not, Alice's options are more limited than Bob's, for Alice will not accept a bargain in which the dependent's well-being is compromised. We're going to get more about this, because this is going to be the threat point. So if you say to me, either you do this or I'm out of here, right? She's going to go, whoa, I depend on you for money, and I can't just leave because then the baby will be left and you're terrible at taking care of the baby because you don't know how to do it, etc., right? And so she's kind of in a bad position. If women are categorized as those responsible for dependence, then this generalizes. Women will often endure bad relationships, even violent ones, for the sake of the kids. They will forego educational and work opportunities for the sake of the kids. But it isn't just for kids. Women make sacrifices for the sake of their partners, their extended family, their friends and coworkers, because relationships matter. And women are systematically disadvantaged due to a gendered form of what Nancy Folbray calls compulsory altruism. Okay. Crucial to the imbalance in bargaining positions is what is called the threat point. Where do you give in because the risk of not doing so is too great? Risk arises when one of the parties is more committed to a dependent's or loved one's well-being than the other. More generally, those who have a better fallback position have more power. Not all of us have a safety net. And so if you don't have a safety net, you're going to pretty much take the bargain that you get. Right? And you're not going to be able to say, well, you just go ahead and leave, or you just go ahead and whatever, because you're kind of a caregiver and you need support in your caregiving. So for our purposes, a crucial aspect of the pattern is that it's systematic and self-reinforcing. Small differences of inequity between genders can feed into processes that generate more serious inequity. Although I focus so far on the dynamics that occur within relationships, the problems multiply when a relationship was never intended or established, or when it breaks down. So single mothers are much more common than single fathers because the gender division of labor is not simply assumed within the relationship, but across society, right? So will often happen that the guy leaves and the woman has the kids and you get a single mom. Separated, divorced, widowed, and single women are still expected to do the bulk of care work, including caring for their children, others' children, the disabled, and the elderly. So one's bargaining position with all of one's relationships to extended family, friends, bosses, landlords, etc., is affected by one's caregiving responsibilities. What it means to be powerful in caring terms is to be able to foist off the unpleasant parts of care onto others and take on only the care duties we find worthwhile. And that's what women do with white women do with women of color, and what men do often with women. And so there's this power differential that develops that is going to be systematic and self-reinforcing. So you can see, like, women will say, sorry, I'm not going to, the boss says, okay, you can have a raise if you work 80 hours a week or 60 hours a week. And she'll say, sorry, I can't do that because I have kids. Boom, he's got that power. I'm assuming the boss is male, but it could be a woman, to sort of give her these large disadvantages because her threat point got reached. She's not going to sacrifice her relationship with her children. Okay, this isn't just gender. Systematic inequity of this sort is not simply a pattern in gendered relations. It's a general feature of bargaining when one party faces greater risks in the fallback position. For example, workers face a broad range of harms to themselves and their families if they don't accept the wage contract. Undocumented immigrants face deportation if they don't accept bad terms of employment. The disabled face severe marginalization if they don't accept even inadequate accommodation, like those stairs, the fire escape. People who in wheelchairs can't get down those. They're going to die in a fire. But accepting such terms just furthers the power of the other party, the powerful game advantage that protects them from the risks in the next round of bargaining. And this advantage also enables them to punish those who fail to conform, so the cycle continues. Okay. There are two important lessons to learn from this, and I hope I've given you enough information to see how they work. But first, the dynamics of inequity are systemic and are not distinctively capitalist, patriarchal, or white supremacist. Of course, the particular forms of disadvantage and the groups that are disadvantaged in our particular historical and cultural social formation, they are patriarchal, capitalist, and white supremacists, and those are shaping the disadvantages. But this bargaining challenge is not distinctive of any of these, right? You can get it with, as I gave you an example of disabled and non-disabled people. You can get it in lots of different cultural settings where there's status that comes with your caste or other aspects of your culture. But just blocking the historically specific dynamics will not prevent systemic inequity as long as we rely on categories to divide labor and the payoffs of the division are unequal. That is, preventing systemic inequity requires sustained intervention into the process by which labor is divided and such divisions are maintained. So this means if you've got categorization and you've got kind of social learning from people in your category, and there's going to be some people doing care work or other kinds of dirty work and are dependent on someone else, then boom, you're going to get it. You're going to get this inequity. So this is what O'Connor says. When we take steps to ameliorate the outcomes of these processes, we should expect our fixes to be temporary. The structures driving inequity are still there, and social dynamics can easily carry us back to inequitable patterns in division. The battle for social justice is against a hydra that grows a new head each time one is cut off. So you can't think we're going to have a revolution and then it's going to be great, because it probably won't be. Because we need the division of labor. Categorization is really important to sort of have a workable division of labor. Once you've got the categorization and different norms for different people in the categories, it's very easy for inequity to occur. Second, if we're thinking about transformative social change, and if we see this as disrupting self-sustaining patterns of inequity, we should not assume that we have failed unless we've put an end to all of the self-reproducing cycles of inequity that currently exist. Because, it's going to be really hard to get them all, crushed at the same time. This is Diva Woodley. She has written this excellent book on the Black Lives Matter movement and is a wonderful scholar. And she says, conceptualizing freedom as mélange means rejecting freedom as a binary, one is either free or not, and holds a linear developmental view of progress toward a definitive freedom. Oh, sorry. I'm going to start that over. I felt like, I have to tell you what mélange came. It came from work in the Caribbean about what would it be for Africans to become free. And so there's a long history here. You should look it up. There's really nice work on this. So it has this history to it about it's going to be a constant battle, right? We're going to be constantly working on this. Anyway, so I'll go back and start over because I got distracted. Conceptualizing freedom as mélange means rejecting freedom as a binary, one is either free or not, and holds that a linear developmental view of progress toward a definitive freedom will always yield a distorted picture that cannot account for empirical conditions of oppression and domination. Instead, freedom in this sense affirms we're always in the process of flight toward freedom, freedom as liberation, which is the ongoing undoing of common understanding, systems, and practices that reproduce oppressive conditions. Put differently, in her view, she calls radical black feminist pragmatism, points to the wisdom that the task of those who care about justice is always and ever will be a striving to continue to get free. Okay. So if the goal is to achieve relief from systemic oppression, then to break out of even one cycle of cumulative disadvantage is a win and should not be disparaged. Of course, we must be attentive to the ways in which the remedy may inadvertently reinforce other forms and sites of oppression, but we should be willing to see the value of incremental changes that destabilize local systems. And that's what I've been this is kind of the theme, kind of getting at. Okay, so power and exit options. Let's go through some of the factors that limit the exit options of women in caregiving roles and give power to men, and they also play a role in other oppressive relationships. And again, I'm going to go through a lot of them, and very few people are going to have to face all of them. But I want to get a lot of them out there because you can see how even if you just face a few of them, that will affect your exit options. Access to wealth. Access to other communal goods internal to the relationship. For example, housing, children, love, and sex. Legal freedoms and benefits. In some cultures, divorce is unavailable or severely punished. Women's wealth and custodial rights are diminished by divorce. That's data from the US. I don't know what it's like in Germany or in Europe in general, but in the US, yes. In the US also, healthcare comes with employment or marriage. So if you're not working, you don't have, and you get a divorce, there goes your healthcare. Access to supportive protective networks outside the relationship. So family-based networks may condemn exit. Neighborhood and friend networks may be lost, especially if exit requires relocation, or may already be unavailable due to migration or employment pressures to move away from kin networks. Education and work experience. Nancy Forbay talked about this. Women who work part-time or take breaks in employment for caregiving are more likely to face unemployment after separation, especially if they maintain custody of children. The skills one develops in providing emotional labor are not easily monetized and are mostly not even recognized. And if they are recognized, you get paid very little for it. Bargaining norms. Women are punished for making demands and hold themselves to norms of deference and accommodation. Even trying to improve one's conditions in a relationship is risky because, lots of guys don't like that. Norms of legitimacy and acceptability, models for a good life are heteronormative. Women's complaints are not taken seriously. Women who leave are stigmatized for leaving. Long-term relationships can constrain one's imagination, and what's unknown or uncertain prompts fear. This is certainly both my mother and my sister. Like they'd never been with anybody other than the people they married. And so when I said, come on, just leave him. He's a jerk. You don't need to stay with him. They go, no, I'm sorry. I can't even imagine living without him. And you go, oh, honey, oh. Ability to make a credible threat that matters to the more powerful bargainer. So those in power have good backup options for wealth, networks, sex, etc., and women tend to have less of that, as was just reviewed. Okay, those are the risks, and they come with marking. We've been talking about marking and social categorization, and not all social categorization is worn on the body, and some of the social categorization is voluntary, but gender is not so voluntary. So I've not yet mentioned, but some social categories rely on embodied social markers so that there is, for many, forced entry. Gender is read off the body, and although it's not impossible, it's difficult to escape it. One does not opt into the gender division of labor, it is imposed. So as long as sex markers are broadly meaningful as a basis for dividing labor, especially care work, but not just care work, gender inequity is likely. And our current system of organizing care work along gender lines, as I've just argued, disadvantages women. But if we flipped it and organized it so non-women are responsible for the care work, it would systematically disadvantage non-women. So again, this is not specifically patriarchal. What's patriarchal is the categorization and the norms that assign us care work. A racial marking creates another embodied category. One does not opt in to being racialized. Being marked as a member of a race situates one in a hierarchical system that imposes norms, divisions of labor, and systemic inequity. The risk of racial violence, the disruption of racialized families through incarceration and child removal. I talked to you about that, about Child Protective Services and how horrible it is in the US. Threats of deportation of minoritized immigrants and the state's racially contingent protection of civil rights all hand power to white people in controlling the black and brown population. Exit for those who wear the markings of their social category on their body is formidable because that situates you within this set of norms that's going to make you dependent on others, and then it's really hard to get away to that. You can't exit those relationships very easily. Okay, disruption. Okay, caregivers as workers. I should speed up, but I shouldn't speed up, right? I shouldn't speed up. I should go, okay, keep it, yeah, okay. Okay, Care work is necessary. It's more likely to be effectively done if there's a division of labor, given the specialized skills it requires. And those who is expected to do it are more vulnerable in bargaining. Yes, we know that. But for reasons mentioned above, strategies that are effective for workers, for example, are not ideally suited to organize family caregivers, such as wives and mothers. Workers spend large amounts of time together and form collective identities. The Beauvoir point was, it doesn't happen as much when you're situated in your family, when you are doing the caregiving situated in your family. You don't have, when you're at work and you can talk to other people at work about what a shit show it is, then you can form kind of collective identity and resistance. It's harder to do that when you don't have that time together as you're doing your work. Workers have families to go back to and provide support. Their work experience and training is considered an asset on the job market. Women are dispersed, and leaving their family destroys the site where their primary needs are met. They're attached to their family members through bonds of love. They identify with their deferential and burdensome roles and are not always comfortable with assertiveness and competition, and skills at emotional labor are not easily monetized. Now, I've been through this already. They don't often have other modes. I just went through all of those sorts of things, but I wanted to bring them up at this moment because I want to say, look, there's a difference between organizing moms and organizing workers at a factory, right? They just don't, there's a different dynamic that's going to have to be in play because workers don't have sex with their bosses normally and love them dearly and produce children with them, right? Anyway, you get the idea. So, one strategy would be to remove social reproduction from the private sphere. So the notion of care has a double meaning. On one hand, it is an attitude of concern or affection one might expect from a family member or friend. On the other hand, it's an activity that might be done by a nurse or a care professional. So good caring, the activity requires skill, and not everyone who has a commitment to affective connection, which is the attitude towards someone, has the skills to care well. And you should know, too, sometimes if you're elderly or disabled in certain kinds of ways, you kind of don't want your nearest and dearest taking care of your bodily functions. You want someone who's a care professional. They might be better at it, they have training, and it's not so embarrassing, right? Organizing caring activity through formal institutions and providing training in a way that cultivates caring attitudes and paying good wages for it is definitely one part of a solution. Care activity need not be divided along gender lines, and if it's managed well politically and economically, this proposal suggests that oppression could be avoided. But I don't think that's really adequate, because it matters who's caring for you when you're an infant or ill or dying. It matters who you're having sex with and whose emotional needs you're meeting and who meets yours and with whom you're intimately crafting your life. Being able to become and remain a social subject up to the very end, not just having one's physical needs met, but also concern and affection by particular individuals over time, that's really important. And there are reasons why we hope that we'll be cared for by individuals who know us well and have seen us through thick and thin. It's no accident that long-term relationships are meaningful because we change as we grow old and we can't do the things that we used to be able to do. And being with someone who can remember you when you could do that is a kind of important part of developing a narrative of your life and sort of feeling like you're a full person. And to say, oh yeah, well, you don't really need that. All that care stuff, we're gonna have someone professional do it. That doesn't really work. So, did I miss something? Caregivers are not fungible, and who we are is at least partly a matter of who we love and care for, but a commitment to emotional connection is demanding of time and energy, and it isn't always symmetrical, though it can be. We should work toward that. So can the state help? So the first strategy of disruption was just commodify caring activity, let it be something that you have workers to do, and don't worry about it, pay them well, and that's a part of a solution, I think, but it's not a complete solution. So maybe we want to have the state come in and help. So another important strategy is to secure state benefits and protections for caregivers. In the US, there are child tax and food benefits for some households with children, and there is certainly more that the state could do to recognize the burdens of care work and provide a safety net. No question about it, like health care. Okay, but at least in the US, government intervention is unreliable and hard to access for those most at risk. Reliance on the government is stigmatized, and to be honest, the government is untrustworthy. I've talked to you about this before. Black and brown families, immigrant families, queer families, and families that don't fit the heteronormative Christian model should not trust the state, at least the states that I've always been familiar with. Most states are run by men who benefit from the gender division of labor, and usually they enforce and uphold its norms. And the state, at least in a liberal society, is focusing on protecting individual rights, but the challenge of social reproduction is a collective issue that should be addressed collectively. It not only shifts control, so if we give it to the state, that's a way of shifting control from the community, and it also depoliticizes the process by which we're going to come to mutual understandings and practices together, making it seem like the state is an allegedly neutral party can solve the conflicts, but the state is not neutral. The state, as we know, is partisan, right? So, in my first lecture, I argued that in order to understand a social system, we must see it not just as a fixed structure like a roadmap, but as having dynamical properties. One way to think about it is to imagine social space topographically as a bowl, a mountaintop, and a hillside. So, caregivers are often stuck in a bowl. You try and leave it, and you fall back down. You try and leave it, and you fall back down, because it's self-reinforcing, right? That's the bowl. It's a stable equilibrium point that returns you to the same place you were before. There are two kinds of unstable equilibrium points. One is when you're on the top of the hill, things could go either way. You just blow, boom, you're off on one side or the other side. There's another kind of unstable equilibrium point that I call a hillside, where it's going to be much harder to go up the hill than down the hill. So it's not either way could happen. It's going to be most likely, if there's going to be a destabilization, something that destabilizes it, it's going to go in one way, not the other way. So if we're in a bowl, change will revert to the starting point. This is sometimes called a negative feedback loop. It's weird because we think of negative as a bad feedback loop, but whatever. Unstable equilibria produce positive feedback loops, so the system evolves away from the starting point. So this is just terminology and systems dynamics. It's not ordinary language. If we're on the hilltop, change is likely, but could go either way. What we're hoping for in promoting social change is to create a hillside so that going in the right direction is more likely than going back up the hill. And in such cases, the equilibrium is destabilized without all-out revolution, because if you've gotten to the point where you're on the hillside, a little thing could just push you down the hill, right? That's the cool thing about hillsides. Just little, you have to work really hard to get yourself on a hillside, but once you're there, okay. So, how do we get there? If not state solutions and professionalization, then what are we going to do? I don't for a moment think there's a one-size-fits-all social movement. Different challenges and different conditions require different forms of resistance. This question is narrower. Is there a way to disrupt family, care work, and inequity? The key factors keeping it in place are norms, both about dividing labor and bargaining, and risk. Some recent examples of social movements that have changed norms include the anti-smoking movement, the anti-drunk driving movement, the marriage equality movement, the pro-gun in the US NRA movement, the anti-abortion movement, and there's a sense in which they have changed what it means to be a smoker, a drunk driver, a gun owner, to be married or have an abortion. Some of them are good and some of them are bad. These movements have very different visions of social justice and human well-being, But what they have in common is they've mobilized large numbers of people to change their ideas and their behavior and have shifted social norms. So what I'm suggesting here is, getting a new policy or a new law, yeah, sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not good, it depends on the state and all that sort of thing. What we need is to change social norms. We need to change how we, so in my language, the cultural techne, we need to change how we are marking bodies. We need to change how we categorize people. We need to change the associations between those categories and the norms and the scripts, all of that sort of stuff. So if that's what we're trying to do, the state is not a good answer. What we need is a movement that is going to enable us to bring about those changes. Some of these are directed at political and judicial outcomes, but those outcomes arguably are the result of their influence on the default understanding of how we live together. So this is something else I've also argued, that, I like judicial activism. I like it when Brown v. Board of Education in 1955 said that public schools had to be desegregated. Yes! I was born in 55, so I didn't actually get to do that. But that's how I feel about it. But it has not worked. It took a decade for schools to be desegregated with a huge amount of conflict. And the fact is that the desegregation orders were lifted in 1990, and currently the public schools, this is a ProPublica report, the public schools in those districts are as segregated as they were in 1955, right? So I love Brown v. Board of Education, but it didn't have local support. The social norms and the understandings were not there to support it, and we're still incredibly racist. And they were thinking, okay, we're gonna solve the problem of racism by making kids go to school together. So it didn't work, that didn't work. Okay. But that's not to say some judicial activism is good. It's not the answer. Okay, so what is the answer is organizing. Americans didn't suddenly stop smoking because it simply went out of fashion. Gun enthusiasts weren't able to stock up on semiotic assault weapons without legislative and regulatory allowances. Heterosexuals didn't embrace marriage for same-sex couples because it seemed like the right thing to do. These changes occurred because of the relentless advocacy of vast networks of individuals and organizations, campaigning in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles and often against entrenched, powerful opponents, and yet they prevailed. And how? In the absence of a predominant ideology or values, I don't know what that set seems like it shouldn't be there. I'm sorry. In the absence of a predominant ideology or values that might explain why certain sides prevailed, we know that the answer to why some movements catapulted forth to victory while others faltered had to do with how they were organized. Okay, that's the image that I've shown you 3 times. Yeah, cool, I love that image. It's better than the protein, I think. Anyway, on the model I've been presenting, our ways of framing the world are shaped by the practices that we engage in and the terms of cooperation that are available. Now, individualists, not me, but those folks, let's say bad people, they're not bad people. They're not really bad people. But those others tend to think that a person has a fixed set of tastes and preferences. When choosing amongst a set of alternatives, he or she compares the attributes of those alternatives and selects the one which most closely corresponds to his or her preferences. On this conception of social agency, the task of movement work is to convince, nudge, or incentivize individuals to do things differently. So what you're doing is you're saying, oh, you see, that's your preference, but you really ought to prefer this. And I'm going to incentivize you to do this, or I'm going to nudge you to do this, or something like that. And on a network model, that's not the right way to do it. Once we start thinking in terms of networks and relations, the activity of organizing looks different. Education and argumentation are still important, but influence is a huge factor, and influence happens in non-explicit and non-rational ways. And I know some of you who are really into autonomy are going to get upset about this, but I'm not really into autonomy in that sense. Just making it really clear. Although deliberation about what to think and what to do matter, a lot of our social interaction is interactively shaped. We're fantastically adept at adjusting to others in our communities. This is the whole point about practices and about ideology. We want to organize ourselves in a way that we cooperate, and so we're very, very likely just to find ways through this process of social learning to pick up on the cues and behave in accordance with them. And when you fall out of sync with others around you, it's really uncomfortable, right? Really. So the choices people make, their attitudes and opinions are influenced directly by other people. The medium via which this spreads is the social network. So let's think about your social network. Take a minute. Who's in your social network? Evidence suggests that everything we do or say tends to ripple through our network, having an impact on our friends, that's the first degree, our friends' friends, 2 degrees, and our friends' friends' friends, that's 3 degrees. Our influence gradually dissipates and ceases to have a noticeable effect on people beyond the social frontier that lies at 3 degrees of separation. But I think this is a cool factoid, one of the best predictors of whether someone will go to a demonstration is whether a friend of theirs is going. Interesting, huh? It's not about whether they believe that the demonstration is a good cause. It's because their friend is going. Okay. If we add that each of us had the capacity to have 150 friends, who knows how they came up with this number, but it's called the Dunbar number. Then taking into account our 3 degrees of influence, we can, in principle, have influence on over 300 million people. Not everybody. Okay, note that the disenfranchised have few friends or ties to those with power or resilience. And in terms of household type, single-parent families have fewer social resource connections than average. Because those moms, they don't have any time to hang out with their friends. They're working and then, taking care of their kids. So, no. Okay, moreover, members of disadvantaged communities tend to rely on strong ties to their closest support system. This can be problematic because it leads to small bonded clusters lacking in diversity and access to information and ties and resources outside, right? So the ties and resources outside of that are less accessible. Okay, so what this means is that if you're in a highly vulnerable position, you're gonna, hang close to your people because they're the people who you can trust and are gonna support you, right? And you don't have access to, and also you don't have any time. Okay, we talked about that. So an important way to change behavior and provide access to resources is to connect people to a broader network. The most powerful form of network is the many-to-many network. Being in a group that's connected to another group significantly increases your resources, and this bridging or linking capital is the kind of connectivity from which most people benefit. So that picture up there is a many-to-many, and you can get a connection from one, like from the reds to the orange, just because there are a few people in the middle who are connected. So you don't have to have all of the people in one group connected to all of the people in the other group. You just have to have a group, and then there's a connection between them. And so information and resources and all of this stuff passes between them. Hello? Okay, so this suggests that networks can address 2 problems at once: broadening the distribution of resources and changing norms. I'm thinking, especially it's going to increase information, but also social capital, cultural capital, all of these Bourdieuian things that matter are going to be passed through the networks. And research on social movements connected with this network stuff suggests that chapter-based networks are distinctively effective in producing epistemic norm change. Chapter-based movements consist of a network of local organizations unified in a formal network. So Black Lives Matter is a network-based organization. There's a Boston chapter. There's chapters all over the city, all the major cities. There's a BLM chapter. And you can go and get involved in the BLM work in your community. But there's an overarching sort of model for, okay, how are we strategizing? What is our overarching goal and such like that? These are like unions do this too. And the pro-life movement did it. The pro-life movement had their little chapters and their churches and whatever, and they had their overarching strategies. There are actually several of these organizations because some were more religious and some were less religious and whatever. But chapter-based networks are responsible for us losing the right to abortion, right? That's bad. from my point of view, and we need to learn from them how they did it because we need to take it back. Okay, so this is Barbara Ransby. So in chapter-based networks, groups on the ground organize in a community. They have local knowledge of the community concerns, what it's likely to motivate participation, what discursive frame will be effective, and who is a respected spokesperson. And considerable leverage is given to local organizers in this model. This is captured in Barbara Ransby's article on Black Lives Matter. She says the idea behind that model is that when people on the ground make decisions, articulate problems, and come up with answers, the results are more likely to meet real needs, and that's more sustainable in the long run. People are better prepared to carry out solutions they themselves created instead of ones handed down by national leaders unfamiliar with realities in local communities. Such local work allows people to take ownership of the political struggles that affect their lives. This is part of what I was trying to talk about yesterday when I was talking about the situation in Kenya and the situation in Colombia, is that even though the method examples I gave were in the global south, this is a method that is also used in other contexts, and what happens is that you can begin to build networks. So in the United States, in Boston, there's an organization called Love Your Menzies, and they have a chapter in Kenya. So we're getting the people in Kenya at the Society Empowerment Project to connect with the Kenyan people, and then the Kenyan people have this connection to the US, and the US organizations have connections to Scotland and wherever, all of these places. So here is a possibility of creating a chapter of a broader network of organizations, and does so in exactly the way that Barbara Ransby talks about it. So at the same time, the chapters are connected to a network that provides name recognition and publicity, advice and support, and often financial and legal resources. Ransby continues, brick by brick, relationship by relationship, decision by decision, the edifices of resistance are being built. The national organizations are the mortar between the bricks. That fortified space will be a necessary training ground and refuge for the political battles that lay ahead. So, a key factor in the success of chapter-based movements is the new networks they create. Think of it this way: the structure of a social system is a network of individuals and resources. That was the point of my first lecture, and the whole idea of thinking of our social formation as a dynamic system. It's not just a set or collection of individuals and resources, but individuals and resources in relation to each other. And the relationships and the dynamics built into them make all the difference. Local chapters build solidarity around a matter of shared concern, and this provides support when undertaking risky behavior, like you go to the demo with your friend, demanding more and bargaining, or taking steps to reduce the payoff to the already privileged party in the relationship. Strong ties with others in the network are predictors of willingness to engage in collective action. For these ties bring mutual trust and a sense of responsibility, but weak ties, which are the ties that you get to the friends of friends and the friends of friends of friends, those are also extremely important. That's what the network consists in. Once there's critical mass, the willingness to participate begins to cascade. If most of the people whom you know and who share your disadvantaged situation elect to mobilize and fight, then fighting is more likely to seem like the appropriate line of action to you. So, what are the sites of power? This site could probably skip. Should I skip it? I've gone a long time. I think I'll skip it. Okay, there's all these different, you need to create spaces where you can get together and hang out and talk and that. Okay, so, sorry. Yeah, well, you gotta tell your story of self and your story of us. Okay, so can a chapter-based care movement make a transformative difference? All I can say is that it's possible, right? Because we're in a complex dynamic system. I don't know, and sometimes I think it's gonna be impossible, but it's possible. The movement for Black Lives is a chapter-based movement. It has already had major impact and includes care issues among its priorities. Can several such organizations or movements build a coalition to revolutionize our social formation, to disrupt capitalist, white supremacist, and patriarchal dynamics? All I can say is it's possible. So in my 3 lectures, now I'm just summing up and then I'll read this wonderful quote. In my 3 lectures, I've argued that societies are complex dynamic systems that maintain themselves while also changing. Such systems evolve as the result of the interaction of multiple internal dynamics as well as inputs from the system's environment. The internal dynamics include the cultural logics of race and ethnicity, gender, sex, sexuality, capital, eugenics, politics, heteronormativity, ethnic sort of bias, etc., history, and more. The material environment includes, of course, the weather and the climate and the geography, other societies and systems, and biological systems, including our bodies, and the system maintains itself and evolves without central authority. That's the message of the first lecture. I've also argued that transformative social change, even if it aims to be revolutionary, may occur by intervening in a, oh my God, this is not, I kind of got delayed today doing my slides, and so I think I made some grammatical mistakes when I cut and pasted, and I'm really sorry about that. Everybody does it, right? Especially if it's all, spell check doesn't find it because it's ungrammatical, not just bad spelling. Okay, I've also argued that transformative social change, even if it aims to be revolutionary, may occur by intervening, okay. What I'm saying here is that transformative social change can sometimes happen incrementally, right? And if you intervene in the systems, you can build up slowly, more and more chapters of your organization who are doing stuff on the ground and networking with each other. And that is a good way to think about going, right? That's the point. In this lecture, I've argued the subordination of women is deeply connected to a division of labor that relies on gender categories to distribute care work. Although law and policy can make a difference, we should be working towards changing social norms, both as a way to accelerate change of policy and also to make a difference in the private domain. One important way to do this is to engage in chapter-based network organizing and work towards scaling it up so the impact can be greater. Is possible enough? All I've argued is that it's possible to have transformative social change, and especially around care. I haven't argued exactly how to do it or what organization to join, but I've kind of given you some guidance about how to start a chapter organization. Anyway, even powerful collective action has uncertain results, but there is reason to hope in a sense that Rebecca Solnit captures, and this is one of the quotes that keeps me going even in my darkest moments. She says, cause and effect assumes history marches forward, but history is not an army. It is a crab scuttling sideways, a drip of soft water wearing away stone, an earthquake breaking centuries of tension. Sometimes one person inspires a movement or her words do decades later. Sometimes a few passionate people change the world, and sometimes they start a mass movement and millions do. Sometimes those millions are stirred by the same outrage or the same ideal, and change comes upon us like a change of weather. All these transformations have in common is they begin in the imagination and in hope. I say all this because hope is not like a lottery ticket you can sit on the sofa and clutch feeling lucky. I say it because hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency, because hope should shove you out the door, and because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures, and the grinding down of the poor and the marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action, and I invite you to be agents of possibility. Thank you very much. So kind. Thank you so much. All right. So now we're going to have some conversation, yes, which I love. I love.
Thank you so much for this yet another inspiring, rich talk. And we'll have as usual, a Q&A. We have these 2 mics. Please queue behind those mics, and yeah, so we'll go. That was a great last sentence, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
It's good to wrap it up. Okay, so just start.
So I would just go, wow, wow, wow. That's just so inspiring, and I love the groundwork that you've carved in kind of setting a path to really moving on and doing some social change. I'm trying to kind of get my thoughts together here. So I'm thinking about the distinction that you started with, the micro, meso, and micro levels. And the ideal, as I take it, is that we want disruption at all levels.
Yes.
But in a way, I think you've focused, I mean, you said that the most important level is the meso, the cultural techne, this kind of package of norms, roles, scripts, and things that have this dual cognitive and social kind of dynamics. I'm wondering, in a way, so I'm wondering, yeah, where does the change should come? Is it in terms of incentives to people, or is it kind of also change top-down? Or thinking again about the game theoretic model from Kayla O'Connor, she would say that in a way the primary factors to why we end up oppression or a disadvantage emerges is because we have typing, the marking in terms of social categorization. And that's something hard to intervene on. That's our kind of resources. The second factor that she focuses on is the type conditioning, the fact that people imitate and kind of condition, as it were, their strategies based on their in-group, and obviously they will treat fairly their in-group and disadvantage the out-group. And so I'm wondering, because it looks like indeed the structures emerge out of this social learning and cultural adaptation. And that's what maintains the, as it were, the stability in terms of the equilibrium and so on. So what are where's the hope here to really disrupt that?
Yeah.
Is it then at the level of kind of individual actions? Do we need, I don't know, nudging or indeed shaping our roles in the cultural techne? Or how should the work be done?
Yeah, that's really helpful. So last time when I was talking about Thielen and Mahoney and Thielen, they had these 4 different ways of thinking about incremental change. Drift, conversion, I can't remember the other 2. Anyway, I can't remember the names for them. But the idea is that rules have to be interpreted, norms have to be interpreted, and they're not always enforced. I mean, there's all this slippage in the cultural techne. And I take inspiration from Judith Butler on this because she's interested in ways in which, and also William Sewell, that because the cultural techne is sloppy and gappy, and because it doesn't enforce itself, we have to be the enforcers of it, and we're not that great enforcers. There's all these possibilities of doing things differently and still getting away with seeming like you're following the rules. Or layering, that was one of the other ones. The rule's there, but you just have another rule on top of it, or whatever. And I think that that's the kind of idea I have in mind, is that because we're talking about culture, after all, there are this kind of open-endedness to meaning and open-endedness to culture that gives us space. And I think in terms of gender, we've gone a long way in changing the cultural techne, right? I mean, on my Zoom little box, I have my pronouns, you know, and a lot of people I know do as well. I mean, that's a huge shift from even just 5 years ago. So I actually don't think that there's the cement columns holding it in place. I think it's this very mushy, kind of flexible, evolving, open-ended thing. So I don't know if, Michaela, if that helps. Did that help? Okay.
Okay, since we don't have someone on this side, just go ahead.
Hi, Sally. Nice talk. I appreciated the PowerPoint. I thought it was very funny in a way.
I'm glad you like them, even when they're so ungrammatical. I am so sorry about that.
I always have fun too with little pictures. So I have something of a follow-up, but also like a two-split question. So my first question regards your idea of gender and basically this threefold way you made up. So first of all, we mark bodies, then we have ideology coming on with all the norms and the scripts, cultural technique gone wrong, and then we have the hierarchy that builds upon this. And I agree with you that like in a structural way, if you look at patriarchal logics, you have, I got it, you have patriarchy as like a system of dominion of man over woman. Yeah. So my first question basically is, can we change these social norms? Can we change how we mark bodies in like a fundamental way that it goes away? What I mean by this is I'm in a way a gender pessimist, so I know some non-binary people who believe, oh, okay, we're just not gonna perform any gender, we're out of the binary, eventually gender is gonna go away. And I personally don't believe that gender is gonna go away. I duly believe that there is what you described, this change of social techne. I believe that eventually in like a 50, 100 years, a gender binary could transfigure into a gender trinity. But do you believe that there is a way of like changing cultural techniques so that they go away fully, so that we do not look at other people's bodies and categorize them by, I don't know, the size of their breast, the sound of their voice, etc., etc.? And my second question just links up onto that. So, because when I follow up on what I believe that you can't fully abolish gender, my best option to solve this whole patriarchal bullshit would be to, okay, I think we're still going to categorize people by gender, but let's make the difference as little as, I don't know, I have brown eyes, you have green eyes, so that we change gender to something that is not organized in a hierarchical way, so that you might have gender X and gender Y and gender Z, just as meaningful as, in your example, you have the driver and the navigator. It's maybe a fun, maybe a meaningful division of labor, but it doesn't result in this terrible oppression and grinding down. So my first question, do you believe that we can fully delete social techniques like gender? And my second question, do you believe that we can change ideology, social norms of gender to not build this gender hierarchy if you believe, as I do, that you can't fully abolish gender? Thank you.
Thank you, and it connects with Michaela's question really well, because I think she's also asking about how flexible is this anyway. So I'm on record in saying that I think it would be wrong to not recognize the reproductive capacities of certain bodies, because I'm a Beauvoirian about this. I think women I think people who are pregnant capable contribute more to the species biologically than people who aren't, because the people who aren't can ejaculate and be done, and the people who are pregnant capable, they have to spend 9, however many months and, deal with lactation and all of that. And so Beauvoir said that females, the things in the world with large gametes are by nature disadvantaged, and we need to compensate them for this disadvantage. And although I don't think I'll go quite as far as she went, I kind of think that's right. And that it would be wrong to not recognize pregnant capable people as pregnant capable, also susceptible to, various kinds of problems that come along with pregnancy. And to give people, and I also just even think, given the stuff I talked about in Kenya, I think you need to give people tools for understanding menstruation and cramps, and there has to be a techne for this. And that techne is going to track certain kinds of bodies, and I don't think that has to be binary. I don't think it has to be worn on the body at all times, et cetera, like that. But I think that there's something deeply important. And O'Connor says that she has this distinction I didn't talk about between sort of functional distinctions and merely arbitrary distinctions. And she thinks that gender differentiation started out as functional because of the ways that women, before there was birth control, before there was formula or whatever that females used to manage their reproductive capabilities, that they were tied much more closely to infants. And so, but then the problem is that it took on this role that you're objecting to, where it became a type that covered all of it. So I'm sympathetic to your view, and I don't know if we're going to be able to get to that point where it's eye color, earlobe shape, or whatever. I don't think it's going to go quite that far, because as I said, I think we need social services and recognition and cultural norms to help people deal with their bodies, because it's not trivial. It's, but Shulamith Firestone would say, yeah, but we're going to get rid of biological reproduction. So when we do that, then we don't need this anymore. Oh, yeah, I hope that's good. Did I cover enough of your questions?
Yeah, that answered my question.
So now we have
I
another
will not
line.
answer so long. I'll try and be quicker.
It's okay.
Hello. So thank you so much. I don't know why every time I ask a question I get so nervous again.
Oh, it's okay. Don't get nervous. It's all right. We all love you, right? Don't you? Say, I love you. It's okay. See? Go ahead.
So yes, 2 questions. The first one is I would like you to develop a bit more, like I want to understand what is the place of the state, because it seems to have like in your theorizing, because it seems to have like a little role or a negative role. And yes, I wanted to understand, because I still feel the state has like a very big weight in cultural, techne, and like any social system. And it can also be like a force that blocks social change, especially if it's like a military authoritarian state. So what do we do against that? And the second question was about the possible explanations of how inequality emerges, because it does emerge sometimes in difficult to explain ways, but sometimes maybe there is like an explanation for the emergence. Yes, that's it.
Thank you. So I'm not going to be able to answer your question about the state very well, because I focus so much on the meso and the kind of cultural stuff. But I mean, I think part of the role of the state is to protect some basic rights. And I think that there are sources of, so safety and security are important. And I live in a country where there's semi-automatic weapons all around, and people get shot up all the time, and so there's at least a temporary need for a state that can coercively try to take those away from people and protect people. I think that sometimes I imagine a state having a more, thinking of it more in a capability approach, where it's going to provide wonderful education and do all these other wonderful things, and healthcare and et cetera. And I would like the state to do that. But I don't think that, I'm not, I mean, maybe that's what it's for, to do some of those, wonderful things of creating educational systems and healthy economies and healthcare systems and whatever. But I'm inclined to think there are different ways of sort of thinking about the state that are going to be apt for different times and places and histories. And I'm not going to sort of go totally functionalist about it. But other people here will know how to answer that way better than I will. On the issue of explanations for inequality, I mean, the main one I've been talking about is, if you're vulnerable, then you're going to get more vulnerable. And so then the question is sort of, well, how'd you end up getting vulnerable in the first place? And sometimes, vulnerability isn't a bad thing. Vulnerability is something I think is really good. But in a context where vulnerability is exploited and taken advantage of, that's when you get equality going. So in a general sense, that's how I think. Because we're all vulnerable in so many ways, but some people can build up power so that they can protect themselves from that vulnerability. And so finding ways to embrace our vulnerability and interdependence, I think that's a good thing. But these are very big questions, and I don't feel really prepared to answer either of them. So I just guessed. Just kind of made it up.
Okay, so we are actually running out of time, so I'm going to group the last couple of questions, and then you just make your choice.
Sounds good.
Thank you a lot for your speech. And I think some of these topics you touched on a little bit, but I was kind of thinking about, this like movement, especially led by like women and queer folks, to kind of get compensated for all different forms of labor. So like emotional labor, but also like informal education and like care work. But then also, so like obviously I know that that's super important because we live under a system where you need money to survive, so you do need to be compensated for it. But I think it's also gotten to quite extremes where like there'll be tweets like, don't ask your friends this, go to therapy, or like, don't ask your friends to help you move, you should pay movers. And so I'm kind of wondering like, the limits of this, and like to what point will it become like that everything becomes super transactional and we're always measuring exactly how much we give and how much we take. And then a follow-up question to that is also like, I see in myself maybe this danger of sometimes not being able to separate my like internal feelings for work versus like how it's perceived culturally. So like, for instance, dishes is something I really don't have a problem with doing dishes and I actually enjoy it. But then sometimes like if I'm doing dishes for a friend who is a man, I feel like, no, I can't do this because, and so you kind of have this, like you're not able to also, like for people who do enjoy certain types of care work, maybe are not really able to enjoy it because it's like seen as like oppressive. Those are my two questions.
So, one last question,
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. I noticed that knowledge is featured in the title of today's lecture, and one way of understanding the epistemic throughout the talk for me was through the remark you made about gendered care work, the suggestion that gendered care work could be outsourced to professionals and their know-how and their expert knowledge. And on that note, it did stick with me that this is perhaps not the best idea for the reasons you mentioned, that we value care from people that care for us. Another was the remark that influence happens in non-explicit and non-rational ways, and rationality here probably being a placeholder for a number of criteria of epistemic success. I was wondering what one question, what one worry, what one tool, if you had to choose in relation to knowledge, is the most important to you in discussion of care work and bargaining networks or transformative social change.
So can I try and repeat back the question? Because there were so many interesting parts of it. So I heard you asking what matters more, sort of increasing our bargaining power to sort of bring about social change, or to open up more space for love and protect and the sort of interdependence and less bargaining. Is that?
Well, in rephrasing my question, you already gave me an answer.
Oh.
So I kind of asked what epistemic aspect would be the most important to you, and you named two.
Yeah.
And that's already great.
Okay.
Okay, so that was.
I didn't mean to cheat. I mean, but I do think that bargaining is going to just be, we have conflicting interests, right, as individuals, and so we're going to have to sort of sort out our conflicting interests. And I'm answering. Okay, but we just need to love each other, too, in spite of our conflicting interests. So it's going to be like this all the time.
So I think we have time for one more question. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the really illuminating lectures. I had some worries, I guess, about some of the temporality of this last lecture. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, the advertisers and the white supremacists are sort of way ahead on figuring out how to do social networking, right? They already understand all of the degrees and how to get people to do what their friends are doing because they want us to buy their stuff and do their evil deeds.
Buy their guns.
Right. So in some sense, I feel like your hope action trajectory is a little behind what capital and white supremacy and January 6 people and other bad actors are already doing. And on the other hand, with regard to climate change, the patient, hopeful chapter solidarity from the bottom work you're talking about is too slow. Yeah. Right? We can't can't afford the time. So it's of course, so as a model, it's very inspiring, but it just, the temporality feels so like too slow, too fast, and therefore it's hard to square those. Thank you.
Totally. Okay, so the first question.
Sorry for everyone who couldn't.
And I'll be at the dinner. Oh, you're going to announce that, though. Are we going to go? Yeah, well, and then I'll be around. I'll be around. So, yeah, I don't really like the idea in the first question about having it all, pay for, professionalize everything. I think that that's a bad model. And yeah, don't ask your friends to move you and, feed your cat. Yeah, sometimes you have to pay people to feed your cat if they're your grad students because, they don't have as much money. But anyway, never mind. Sorry. But friends, that's friends to help other friends. That would be a terrible thing if we ended up not. And I actually think that we need to find ways to do more of we're interdependent, we help each other, etc. But it's very hard when you're working too hard and staying up too late already, writing your slides and not proofreading them. Anyway, so I don't want to go that way, but you might be interested in the history of socialist feminism and wages for housework debate. There was a long debate. Silvia Federici, other Italian feminists, socialist feminists, that goes back a way. There's a book by Zilla Eisenstein called Capitalism, Patriarchy, and the Case for Socialist Feminism. Lots of really good classic historical texts. I also want to say that I was on AM radio once with a woman who was claiming that feminism had really pushed women's advancement way back, and that we were the problem. And she was on AM radio, which is, talk radio in the U.S. It's kind of a mess. And I said to her at some point, I said, well, look, we give veterans all these benefits when they come back from war. They're protecting us. So why don't we give women who are caregivers all of those benefits, like housing and medical care and all of these sorts of things, because they've contributed to the society. And she said, but that's not feminist. And I went, what? What do you mean it's not feminist? Or anyway, so I think that there are things, the imaginative things that can be done. I'm not, a warmonger by any means, but I think there are things that can be done both by the state and by professionalizing, but I don't want to go there. So I think that we ought to find other ways. And then, yes, I totally get about, and this is a problem of ideology, how do you know when a preference is your own? Authentically your own, and authentic is a bad word, but how do you know that it's really your own if you've been interpolated as a social subject to love it? Well, of course, there's a sense in which, yes, that's you. You love it because you are that social subject. But then there's this other way, you're not supposed to love it because being that social subject is to be subordinated. And I think that's just the problem of how to live in an ideologically problematic society. I don't think there's anything wrong with you. I don't think there's anything wrong with any of us. That's what it is to be totally alienated and have to live in these worlds that have created us to be lesser. Okay, temporality, I'm totally with you. There's a quote in this book by Crutchfield and that I thought was so funny, and the quote said, what we ought to do with the pro-lifers in the NRA is make them work in coalition. Well, because that takes so much work. It's so time-consuming. That's the biggest problem with being an activist, is that you have to go to meetings that last way too long, right? They're like really long meetings. And they have the advantage that they like authoritarians, right? They think, let someone have the power and give them control, and then we'll do what they tell us to do, right? I swear, that's a big part of it. And we don't want to do it that way. But not doing that way is really draining and time-consuming. And so I don't have an answer, because I think this is the morally right way to do it, but we need to be more effective. So we just got to get faster, build our skills. I don't know. That's what I'm kind of trying to offer, is some of these, go in there and you haven't done consciousness raising, so do story of us, story of, now, right? Do that. Okay, do that. And then it takes 2 days. Okay, then you do that. And then you have an actionable thing. And then you do co-design. You do co-design for like a week. Boom. Go. On the ground. Do it. And then you're a chapter. And then you tell those other people, hey, now you get to do that too. And then we're going to network. And see?
Okay, I think this is a very good.
Anyway,
point
I try. I don't have the answer. Get really good at all of that.
Okay, so talking about the division of labor, your job was to give those wonderful lectures. Thank you so much for this. And there have been a lot of people who worked hard the last couple of days for making this possible. So I want all of them to join us here so that you can all see them, make the invisible work visible, the shadow work visible. And then let's again thank everyone, and of course you.
So bring them forward. You're going to bring them up here? Then we're going to have to bow together, right? We're going to go 1, 2, 3, and then bow. Okay, ready? Are they ready? 1, 2, 3. Now you do it again. 1, 2, 3. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, right. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I couldn't have done it without you. All of you. No.
Okay, not everyone is here on the stage who actually did the work.
He's coming.
For the sound, Christoph Daubitz, thank you so much. For the camera, Tobias Rüst, Jean-Pierre Letari, and Jörg Schulze, who manned the cameras and will produce the video with us. We, of course, also want to thank the Stabi again, the Staatsbibliothek, in particular Udo Back, and the whole team who works with the Hausmeister for giving us this really wonderful room for these 3 evenings and inviting us into their wonderful house here. Daniela Burger and Lena Rosbach for helping us with the design, the posters, the flyers, and everything else. Silke Briel and Jonathan Klein for producing the trailer and helping us with the social media work. Our media partners, Philosophie Magazine, especially Maria Kapfer, and Agora 42 Magazine, especially Enea Dragomir and Frank Augustin. And in a way, closest to our hearts, the whole team, who's almost everyone is here. Barbara Heinrich is not here. She was here the last 2 days. We also want to include her. But with us here on the stage are Christian Schmidt, Marvin Ester, Josephine Bergholz, Ruben Heitzmann, Armin Wagner, Sveta Pauli, and Louis Leary. And, well, we're just the faces on the stage. They did all the work. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. You hold him.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, as Sally promised, she's gonna have a drink with you. Everyone who wants to. There's a food truck right across the street at the Philharmonie, and I don't know what the weather is like right now. I mean, maybe anyone has an idea. But if there's no thunderstorm, then we'll go there, have drinks and snacks, and whoever wants to join us is welcome. Just one note there, I mean, the members of the team will have those food coupons, and please allow them to skip the line so that they who might come in a bit later don't have to wait too long.
Okay.